The International Aspirin Foundation was set up in 1974, so it's just had its last year its 40th anniversary, and its remit is to disseminate research information on aspirin and arrange meetings to increase discussion about research and publicise recent developments. The theme was aspirin in the 21st century, and it was really around the issue of what does aspirin do, which we didn't realise it did before. What are the new data on effects of aspirin beyond its effects just on vascular events, and how do we begin to tie together all of these different effects and come up with an overall balance of risk and benefit. Well, we do a lot of research on patients at risk of stroke, so patients with mini strokes, TIAs or warning strokes, and we found very large effects of aspirin in the acute phase in preventing major stroke in that particular patient group. Aspirin reduces the risk of stroke in the next few months by about 70%. So in that situation, it's a highly effective drug in terms of preventing vascular events. We've also done quite a lot of work on the much longer term effect of aspirin on the risk of cancer, and particularly colon cancer. And we and others have shown that if you take aspirin for about 5 years, it reduces the risk of colon cancer by about half. But there's a delay of about 10 years before you actually see that effect, because it's acting on the very early development of cancers, so that it's only 10 years later when that benefit becomes clinically obvious. There was a lot of interest in the understanding the mechanisms of the effect of aspirin, particularly on colon cancer. We know a lot about how aspirin prevents vascular events by acting on platelets, but there's still uncertainty about how it works in terms of the colon and cells that might be at risk of developing cancers. And there were some very interesting data presented on how low-dose aspirin does change the biochemistry and the physiology of cells in the healthy colon in ways that might explain its effect on cancer risk. It probably has a different mechanism. It's certainly different in terms of the latency, so how long you have to take aspirin for to see a benefit. In terms of vascular events, aspirin reduces the risk immediately on the first day that you take an aspirin, whereas for cancer it's a much more long-term calculus in terms of whether it's worthwhile or not. Partly, I think, because what aspirin does is, over and above its effect on platelets, reduces inflammation. And inflammation is a process that's involved in so many different diseases, cancer being one of them, that a drug that reduces inflammation will undoubtedly have effects on a whole host of different diseases, potentially some good and some bad. And I think we're probably only scratching the surface at the moment about what aspirin does. One of the key issues is the ongoing trials, because one of the important questions that people ask is, well, aspirin prevents vascular events, it has an effect on cancer, it also has some risks in terms of bleeding. Should I take it as an individual? And I think one of the difficulties is that the old trials that were done in the 1980s and the 1990s probably no longer apply at the moment, because blood pressure is now better controlled, people are on statins, smoking rates are lower, there are all sorts of differences, and so we're quite excited to see the results of the ongoing trials, the ARRIVE trial and the ASCEND trial and the ESPRIT trial, to see what aspirin does in the 21st century, as it were, rather than the 20th century. The ARRIVE trial is looking at aspirin in relatively healthy people that haven't had a previous vascular event but are at slightly increased risk. So are they a group who would get sufficient benefit from taking aspirin because their vascular risk is increased? And that's a trial of 12,000 patients, half on aspirin, half on placebo. treated for 6 years that will report next year. And then there's a similar sized trial in diabetics, the ASCEND trial. And then a very interesting trial in Australia, predominantly the ASPRI trial, looking at the balance of risk and benefit of aspirin in a much more elderly patient population in the 70s and 80s, the late 70s and 80s. The work that we did and others did, showing that there seemed to be some effects of aspirin on risk of metastasis and risk of recurrence of cancer, has led to several new trials looking at if you have a cancer diagnosed and you have the initial treatment, then if you take aspirin after that, does that improve your long-term survival? And the aspirin trial is the biggest, which is just starting to recruit in the UK, and there's the ASCOLT trial in Asia and several other new trials that are just getting going. I think if you've got existing vascular disease, then the evidence is that it's definitely worth taking aspirin. The benefits outweigh the risks. If you've got a strong family history, perhaps of particularly colon cancer, or if you've got a genetic syndrome that makes you prone to colon cancer, Lynch syndrome, then it's worth taking aspirin. I think the jury's still out if you're otherwise healthy, whether the benefits outweigh the risks, and I think we still need to get better data on that.